Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to another webinar from Intercede and Yubico. This particular one, we're going to be looking about focusing on regulated industries, how we bring high levels of authentication, high assurance into those industries with a particular focus on enterprise attestation. So we'll just wait another minute or two. We can see people still joining and then we'll actually start talking. Again, for those that are just joining, welcome to an Intercede and Yubico webinar on how we can bring stronger authentication with a particular focus into regulated industries, looking at some of those regulations and how enterprise attestation can help you reach those high levels of assurance. So we'll just wait another 30 seconds so we can see people still joining, and then we'll start the webinar. Okay, so we'll get going, we'll kick off. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, in which part of the world. Welcome to the webinar. This is one in a series of webinars between Intercede and Yubico, looking at how we can bring stronger phishing-resistant authentication into enterprises. This particular webinar focuses on regulated industries. We can look at some of the regulations and how those are leading people to look for higher assurance levels of authentication. And in particular, we're going to spend some time looking at enterprise attestation and how that can help you reach those high levels of assurance. So brief background to the webinar, we're going to have about 40-45 minutes of presentations. We will leave some time at the end for Q&A. Please put your questions via the questions icon into the messaging. We'll monitor those. We'll take those at the end of the session. Attendees to the session will be on mute throughout this, so we can't take live questions, but please put them in that question and answer pane, and we'll try to read those out and answer those back to you at the end. If we run out of time or we can't answer them, we will absolutely follow up and get those back to you afterwards. We'll also record the presentation and make it available to you afterwards, and more than happy to have any follow-up demonstrations. There's quite a lot of content to get through in a short time here for what is quite a broad topic, so we're always happy to join calls, follow up, run demonstrations, etc. So the key points we're going to talk through are look at some of the regulations, look at what those regulations tell people they have to do to achieve particular authentication levels of assurance. We'll look at both FIDO passkeys and PKI and how they help you meet those regulations. We're going to have a bit of a focus on passkeys in the enterprise and one of the new features in the FIDO standards, enterprise attestation, and how that starts to make passkeys have some of the same levels of management and control that some other authentication technologies such as PKI have led customers to expect. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and take the Q&A. So just looking who's talking today, I'm Alan Story. I'm the Chief Product Officer of Intercede. I'll tell you a little bit more about Intercede on the next slide. I'm Joe.
And I'm Joe Scalone, Senior Solutions Architect within Yubico. So Yubico is leading the charge for a passwordless future. We've been at the forefront to move forward passkeys, that a new technology that we've all started to hear of that lets you log in without a password. Millions of people in over 160 countries already trust YubiKeys to keep them safe online. Go ahead, Alan.
And Intercede, credential management vendor with multiple products in the portfolio, but the one that plays into this particular space is our credential management system, MyD CMS. That's really aimed at helping organizations deploy credentials, high assurance credentials, simply and at scale in compliance with regulations. So that's the specific product we'll be focusing on today. So starting to look at the regulations, what's out there, what's driving customers to need stronger authentication. The first one on the list, probably the oldest one on here, is GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. So that's focused on privacy. Because it's a regulation, not a directive, it has a direct impact in law. And it's really designed to give people rights over their own personal data. That regulation became a model for many other laws around the world, Brazil, Japan, Singapore, South Africa, Sri Lanka, etc., who follow very similar models. The UK, we've left the EU, but we've enacted actually our own identical UK GDPR legislation. So this law is very widely applicable. What it doesn't do is really tell you anything about how you need to protect access to systems. It tells you should consider it, and you should understand your risks and you should protect against risks, but it doesn't give you any real guidance on what good looks like or what strong authentication looks like. Next one on it is HIPAA. So Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, a US regulation, very much looking at protecting PII, personally identifiable information, and related to healthcare, particularly when it's transferred between third parties. More recently in Europe, DORA, Digital Operation Resilience Act. This is really aimed at improving the cyber resilience of financial services providers. So the regulatory bodies have seen financial service providers come under more and more attack, whether that's for criminal activity, or whether that's geopolitical, trying to bring them down, trying to sort of impact organizations, countries' ability to do business. So because of that increasing level of attack, an increasing sophistication level of attack, that legislation now pushes people to achieve minimum cybersecurity standards. NIS 2, there was, you might ask, where did NIS 1 go? Well, NIS 1 is still out there, and that was aimed at critical national infrastructure. Again, similar to DORA, seeing organizations like energy companies providing critical services into national infrastructures. How do we make sure they have a level of cyber resilience? NIS 2 spreads that regulation out much broader. So the definition of what is critical includes things such as food suppliers, for example, and the supply chain there. So this will affect about 50% of the organizations in Europe. NIS 2 itself is a directive, it's not a law. What the directive states is that each member state within Europe need to have enacted their own cybersecurity legislation, which is law. So NIS 2 has a set of guidelines on what you need to actually apply, and then it's been implemented in law in each individual member state. The final one on here is NIST, so National Institute of Standards and Technology, US-based organization, published multiple standards, internationally recognized as probably the most influential standards body in the world. A number of other standards we see in different countries look back to the NIST standards, the FIPS standard, on what is security and what does good look like. So the most relevant one here is, in our space, is FIPS 201. Subtitle PIV, Personal Identity Verification. So this was a particular standard published that talks about authentication in government and protection of government data. So I'll briefly walk through each of those and look at what do they say in terms of authentication. So this is taken straight from GDPR. So what we tend to see is that the focus of compliance teams within organizations who are subject to GDPR has primarily been on informed consent and everything that entails, the right to be forgotten, the right to access my data, subject access requests, etc. But the law is equally relevant to how your company protects that data once consent has been given. So how do I potentially allow employees to access that data that somebody's decided is available in that environment? Doesn't really give you anything specific. It just says that you must protect access, but it doesn't actually tell how you need to protect access. Looking at HIPAA, so in that healthcare industry, again, it says you must implement authentication measures, but it doesn't really tell you what those authentication measures are. What we're starting to see over time is the more modern legislation starts to get more and more specific about the type of authentication you need to actually implement to achieve compliance. So again, HIPAA states that you need to verify your users, but it's not specific about what technology you could use. DORA, Digital Operation Resilience Act in banking, starts to get more specific. So it now talks about you must implement strong authentication based on relevant standards. That's interesting. So it's not saying that DORA is the relevant standards. It's pushing people to look outside of the regulation to what the relevant standards are. So that's an interesting statement, but it does start to get a little bit more specific. It does at least call out two-factor authentication and specify, for example, something you know, something you have, so that the traditional MFA solutions out there, it doesn't necessarily state how they need, what level of phishing resistance they want, but it does push people to look at external regulations to decide what good looks like. NIS 2 starts to get much more specific. So it does talk about multi-factor authentication, but it also talks about the specific risks and what level of authentication is most likely to protect against that breach. So that starts to get more interesting. It starts to put more onus on the organization to understand what the threats are and how they protect against those threats. At the EU level, it also calls out the use of cryptography and calls out state-of-the-art authentication. It's very difficult in today's world of more and more sophisticated phishing attacks to look at how you could deploy something that isn't phishing resistant and then convince a lawyer that you're actually using something that is state-of-the-art or following best practice. So this is really starting to push people towards phishing resistant authentication, because that's still the #1 cause of attack. And where do we look to find out what phishing resistance actually is and what authentication technologies meet that standard? Best place is NIST. So within the NIST standards, within special publications, they've done a good job of calling out different types of authentication and the characteristics those types of authentication need to meet higher assurance levels. So at authentication assurance level 3, so at the higher level of assurance, it talks about high confidence that the claimant, the person holding the authenticator, actually owns that and has control of it. It talks about the proof of possession of a key through cryptography, public-private key cryptography. So this is really starting to look at the technologies that can achieve phishing resistance. And that really starts to drive you away from traditional one-time password methods up to cryptography-based authentication, which is primarily FIDO passkeys and PKI, public key infrastructure. It also talks about using a phishing-resistant authenticator at the higher levels with non-exportable authentication keys. So we'll come back and talk about what that means a little later on, but we're really looking at a dedicated security device to hold and protect the private key to achieve those higher levels of assurance. So looking at those requirements overall, what do they boil down to? What do the standards boil down to in terms of the authentication requirements? If I were subject to a data breach and I had to convince the people that were looking at finding me that I actually had followed best practice and I was following state of the art, what requirements would I have in place? And even better, if I've got those in place, the likelihood of me getting phished and having a data breach is significantly reduced. So there's a mix of items here: binding devices to users, credentials to users, making sure who's actually got those credentials, so the policy around that, managing the life cycle of it. One of the attacks we see against a stronger credential is the recovery situation. So for example, if I've got a strong two-factor authentication, but I can recover that just via my email, and that email is protected by a password, you're lowering the level of that security. So those recovery mechanisms quite often a form of attack. What we're starting to see now is people wanting multiple types of credentials. So not just PKI or FIDO passkeys for the phishing resistance, but being able to mix both of them together because they meet different use cases. And finally, that auditing and reporting. So not only do I need to know that the right people have got the right credentials, they've been issued to the right policy. When I come in and I get audited, I need to be able to prove that. I need to know who's got access. I need to be able to switch off access when I need it. So we'll walk through some of these and we'll show you how the particular technologies help you meet these requirements that in turn help you meet the needs of the legislation. So the first one is user binding. How do we know who's got which particular device, which particular credential? So our system, a credential management system's job is to make sure the right people get the right credentials. We can do that from integrating with the IDAM solution. So if you've got Entra ID for drop sale point, for example, in your environment that's onboarding people, we can take that data, we can get passed into our system. So we're using a trusted data source. We can do that directly from LDAP or Entra ID. Some organizations mix and match that with operator added individuals for users. Some organizations have secure self-service onboarding, but really we've got the user ID in the system that already exists in your environment. Then we're looking at who gets which particular type of credential. And different organizations have different requirements in this. Organizations that tend to be centralized, quite like an operator-led face-to-face issuance, very high security organizations like this, then they're in real control of, I know the person I'm issuing this to is directly in front of me. I can verify their identity. I know what's happened to that physical key. Other organizations are more dispersed, so they can actually issue these credentials out centralized using a PIN mailer, or they can request them centrally. It can then they have the end user actually collect this at their own workstation. So there's a range of deployment models here, but the key is to keep that end-to-end process secure. And also looking at binding that user, which particular people are allowed which credential. Organizations often grow over time, they acquire other organizations. So using those user data attributes, this person's a contractor, they get this particular credential, that needs to be approved by the contracting manager. Another person's an employee, their line manager can issue the credential, or the admin team can issue the credential. So building all these rules into that user binding process means we can end up with a system so we know who has which specific credential. And what that can look like in a system, so it's just a screenshot of the CMS here. So we can see that this particular person in the system has been issued a device. That device we're looking at here is a Yubico multi-protocol edition device, the YubiKey. So that has both PKI and FIDO passkeys on. And we'll come back and show you that later. So what we're looking at here is binding the credentials to a specific device and binding that to a person.
Which brings up attestation. So there's two different flavors of attestation that we'll end up talking about throughout this presentation. First one is direct attestation, which really refers to that capability to tie the user to a key. But really all you're giving back is the make and model of that key to the relying party. Enterprise attestation takes that a step further. It allows that FIDO authenticator to provide proof of possession by giving you specific information that is baked in on an attestation cert on the key. That could be a serial number, that could be any number of other attributes that you may have predetermined to have in there. But one of the main keys that I want to highlight that is very important within the regulated industry is that with enterprise attestation, you can tie together both PIV attestation and the FIDO2 credential through enterprise attestation, so you know that they are both originating and residing on that same device. So why does enterprise attestation matter? Like I said, it provides that proof of possession. You want to make sure that in your environment, it's the key that you gave to a specific user is the one that they're using to log in. Enterprise attestation is the key to that. It will assure you that the device is authentic. It has all the necessary FIDO certifications and potentially FIP certifications. It really has the ability to assure that the credential has been created with those specific characteristics that you want in your environment. And it provides assurance that the credential was created on a particular device. Enterprise attestation certs are unique to each specific device with a specific serial number.
So now we're starting to look at how do we actually get those devices out to people, and how do we make use of that enterprise attestation to make sure that we hit our policy. So issuance policy generally comes down to factors that I need to implement, that I need to check before I issue the credential. So what's the authenticator type? Is it a YubiKey FIPS device, for example? Device attestation, that helps us know that this device is a genuine YubiKey FIPS device. It's not something pretending to be that. And we can prove that level of attestation. However, without enterprise attestation, I just know that I've issued this person a particular device. You don't know where they got it. Some organizations like to make sure that they only issuing devices that they've bought that are part of their stock. That's what enterprise attestation gives you. So it gives the ability to not only know this is a genuine YubiKey FIPS device or multi-protocol edition device, but which specific one is it? And that starts to open up a number of use cases there, which we'll talk through. User verification. So when you issue the device, am I enforcing two-factor authentication? Do I enforce the user to use a PIN or a fingerprint when they authenticate? Client-side discoverable keys means I can use this as a user nameless. So this is absolutely passwordless. Both PKI and passkeys are passwordless, enable passwordless authentication. With client-side discoverable keys, you can also mean that the end user doesn't have to put their username in. So you could give them a nice frictionless experience. Some of the changes in the more recent FIDO standard, CTAP 2.1, have started to introduce more enterprise-friendly features. Minimum pin length, so you can get control over pin length, change pin on first use, so that starts to enable use cases such as issue on behalf of. Because FIDO's very much come from the consumer background, great for me sat at home with my YubiKey, putting my credentials to log on to Google or Amazon, for example. In the enterprise, organizations tend to want to have a more managed process where a trusted operator issues the primary credential to an individual. And that change pin at first use starts to enable some of those enterprise use cases. And also in some of our government customers or the high assurance customers who supply to government want to comply with those NIST standards because they are one of the few published standard with, in effect, a compliance checklist against high levels of authentication. So if your auditors come in and you can say, I comply with this standard, and this is how we comply with it, starts to put you in a very strong position. So what does that look like in the actual product? Well, we have the ability to issue multiple credential profiles. You can set these up within the system. Each of these you can have a different set of rules on. So what type of device is it? Is it issued face-to-face? Do I allow self-collection? Here we're looking at the particular FIDO rules in here. So am I going to enforce user verification? Do they have to enter a PIN or a fingerprint every time they authenticate with the device? What type of device is it? Is it a high assurance device where a USB, for example, I can take it out, such as the YubiKey, so it's not actually a platform authenticator such as the mobile ID? That gives me security benefits of not being able to share the key with other people, so it's bound to the device. And attestation, so this is the feature that states what level of attestation do I need? Do I want device attestation? So I make sure I'm only issuing genuine YubiKey devices of a particular type. Or do I want enterprise attestation, which means I'm only issuing to my known devices? And what this will do is if somebody tries to issue a device that doesn't have enterprise attestation enabled, it will block it. So this is enforcing that policy. Another setting here, for example, is which authentication server am I using? So a number of our customers want to issue FIDO passkeys to a high level of management, but they want those to work with their Entra ID system as an authentication server. So working with Microsoft on the PKI management APIs they provided, we can now issue those FIDO passkeys securely to a policy, and we can pass that information into Entra ID. So you can use Entra ID for authentication. Moving on beyond the issuance, starting to look at lifecycle management. So updating devices. If we've got PKI credentials on the device, certificates expire, we may need to update those. If somebody's locked a particular device, FIDO side of the device doesn't have the concept of unlock, but that's not a problem. So what we can do is we can perform a simple reprovision activity. So even with that device in the end user's hand, if they've managed to lock themselves, we can run a reprovision job, which will put new certificates on the device. It will put new and recover existing encryption certificates using existing emails. It will put new FIDO passkeys on the device, pass those through to Entra so you can log in, and it will revoke the old credentials. So all of that happens automatically. So all of these complex business processes can be handled and passed between the appropriate systems. And this is much easier to do if you've got multiple credentials, PKI and passkeys on a device, if you know which specific device they're on. So for example, if we've issued PKI credentials to a device, we get the serial number, we know which device they're on. If that device didn't support enterprise attestation, we could also put FIDO passkeys on the device, but we wouldn't know which specific device they were on. So if somebody loses that device, it makes it much harder to revoke the device because you don't know which passkeys are on it. If we've got enterprise attestation, we know that those passkeys and those PKI credentials are on that same device, so we can handle revocation at that device level and pass that through to those alternative systems. And that goes through things like temporary replacement. The reality is people forget devices sometimes, they lose them, they need to replace them. So all of those real world use cases is really what the job of a credential management system is allowed to do, but to keep those policy in place. Destruction at the end of the life cycle. So sometimes people may say that this particular device has been destroyed. I don't want it ever to be used again. So if anybody else tries to issue it, it will block it because that device has been destroyed. Might be it's been lost, potentially it's been compromised, for example, so somebody's handed the device over and passed their PIN on to somebody. You can block that from ever being used in your environment again. So lifecycle management is possible for PKI, and it is possible for FIDO passkeys. What we can do is, if you've got both credentials on the same device, we can bind those processes together much easier with that enterprise attestation, because we know both credentials are on that same device. And looking here, we have customers now using PKI on devices. A lot of those are starting to look at bringing passkeys out as well, because they solve different problems. PKI is great for Windows Logon. It also supports signed emails, encryption, file signing, document signing, etc. Passkeys also give you Windows Logon, authenticating to Entra ID. But if you try and use your device with your PKI on your iPhone or your iPad, for example, it's not so straightforward, doesn't really work very well. But FIDO is built into that. It's built into the browser. So I can easily hold my YubiKey to the back of my iPhone and I can authenticate into a browser-based application. So we're starting to see customers want both types of authentication. But what they want is them on the same device. And they actually want to go further than that. What they don't want to do is have one PIN for FIDO and another PIN for the PKI side of the device, because it really confuses their users. So customers are starting to ask for the ability to have both types of credentials, combined management, and a really simple user experience where they either use a PIN or a fingerprint to access those credentials.
And in listening to customers, we came out with the YubiKey BioSeries Multi-Protocol Edition, which does exactly that. We're able to do both FIDO and PIV on one device using just your fingerprint to unlock either of the two containers, either PIV or FIDO, which allows you to have a better user experience, very streamlined, and makes things a lot easier for you. And I think, Alan, you've got a nice video to show how you would deploy these in your environment.
Yep.
Perfect.
So if our presentation elves can work their background magic in the background, we'll actually show you this working. So what we're about to show you here is somebody collecting a device. So it's been requested centrally, the device is turned up in the post, they're then going to collect this at their own desktop. They can authenticate by multiple ways. It can be a one-time code, an existing smart card, Entra ID integration. We know who the person is. They're now going to collect their device, so they insert their YubiKey. We're now doing a policy check. So is this device the right type with device attestation? Is this device known to me with enterprise attestation? Is it one of my devices? So we're setting a PIN for the device. Importantly here, that PIN protects both the passkey and the PKI side of the device. So the user only needs to set one key here, one PIN. What we're doing now is we're managing all the global platform channels to the device. So we're swapping over factory keys to customer keys. So nobody, not Yubico, not Intercede, not a hacker can get into your device. It's now completely under your management. Writing, generating private public keys for the PKI side of the device. Private key stays on the device. Writing the certificates down to the device. Recovering any encryption certificates you might need for secure email on that device. Now we're going to move on and provision the FIDO side of the device. So again, generating a private public key on the device. Private key stays on the device, never leaves the device. That's really important for security. Once you've got the ability to move a private key off the device, you don't really know where it's gone. So this bound to the device, really important for security. We take the public key here, and in this example, we're actually pushing it into Entra ID. So that device is now fully usable for logging onto Windows, logging onto Entra ID protected applications, signing emails, holding it to the back of my iPhone, logging onto Entra protected applications via the browser. So very functional credential, and both of those credentials issued and managed onto a device with enterprise attestation. So we absolutely know which device those credentials are on. Looking at that, what looks like in the system, some traceability. So you can see down here, we've got a particular serial number for a device. That serial number is for the PKI side. So we know that they're on the same device. We've put certificates on that device. We've also could put one or more passkeys on that device. And because we're tracking that via the serial number, we know they're on the same device. We get that serial number from the enterprise attestation certificate. So that's the key difference. If you've just got device attestation, it tells us it's a genuine YubiKey device of this particular type. With enterprise attestation, we know which specific device it's on, and we can track that in the certificate, which allows us to bind those credentials together and trace them. Same for auditing and reporting. So not only is that captured at the point of issuance, it goes into the system, it goes into the audit trail. We know exactly what we've issued to whom, and then we can track this and trace this through the system. So you can look at what particular types of devices have I got issued. This has been important for our customers over time as the compliance rules change. We all know quantum resistance algorithms are coming. We all know they're coming to the devices. They're generally not quite there yet, but we know everybody will need them. So imagine forward to a point in the future where you've issued devices from the system. You've got here traceability of these devices are using RSA keys. These devices are using ECC keys. These devices are using smaller RSA keys. I might need to update them to larger RSA keys. Well, the system can help you do that because it knows what's out there. It knows what cryptography has been used on which device, for which credentials, for which person, and it allows you to request updates to that in batch, even ahead of the device or the certificates requiring. So you can manage and control all that. And as quantum resistant algorithms start to become available on devices, then systems like this can help bring you that crypto agility. What's out there? What needs to be updated when? How can I actually do that? So tracking and tracing all this, very important.
But why? That's the big question that some people have asked me. And it really comes back to phishing. So we'll get into what phishing is in just a moment to make sure that we're all level set. But why is it so important to really have a phishing resistant credential? We know cyber attacks are on the rise. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. The primary method that we've seen in research that adversaries are using has been phishing as a point of entry. We've seen the costs associated with this start to skyrocket to the point of where research has shown that it's going to cyber crime is going to cost the world $10.5 trillion this year, which would effectively make cybercrime the third largest GDP in the world, behind the United States and China. I don't know many companies, I don't know many countries that wouldn't like a piece of that money back. Also, $10.5 trillion would really represent the greatest transfer of economic wealth in the history of man. Phishing-resistant authentication can help prevent that loss. So what is phishing? Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Sorry, Joe, I can't resist it. Sorry, based in the UK. Just looking at a real-world example, Marks and Spencer, flagship retail organisation, were relatively recently broken into, people planted ransomware. Massive threat to business continuity. They couldn't put goods on the shelves. They couldn't do online retailing. The systems were brought down for weeks. Hundreds of millions of dollars of lost revenue. The people that broke them in were very young. These were not super experienced nation state funded hackers, organization called Scattered Spider. They were using ransomware services that you can just buy on the dark web. And they were using phishing services you could buy on the dark web. They used relatively straightforward social engineering attacks to break into this organization, got in, planted ransomware. If they were using phishing resistance authentication, that would not have happened. It's as simple as that. Sorry, Joe, I couldn't resist that one.
No, you're fine. We've got a number of different case studies that are out there on our website showing how phishing-resistant authentication could help. The other part that we can't necessarily measure really is the loss of reputation when a company is facing any form of attack. So what is phishing really at the end of the day? It is when you have it's a type of cybercrime where malicious actors really impersonate a lot of times a legitimate company or person to trick a target into revealing some form of important information. In some cases, that's a password. In some cases, that's really a person's name. You can go online and see people doing this for fun. It's out there, it's pervasive, and it's easy to do. So how do we prevent that? Well, NIST saw this issue, saw it was affecting the government, and came right out and said, hey, you must use phishing resistant MFA. It must be based in cryptography. As Alan already mentioned, cryptography and modern authentication is something that you see in the regulations for a reason. It works. Cryptography is the underpinnings or the main methodology of PKI, passkeys, whether it's device bound or not. PKI is there, and you cannot share that private key. Private truly means private, which is the advantage of using phishing resistant MFA. Now, one of the things that this ultimately helps with, and really where we want to see everybody get to, is to be able to secure your complete credential life cycle with attestation and really with cryptography, whether it's through the onboarding, straight on through to credential recovery, and every step of the way. This will help create a phishing resistant enterprise, which will make you much more resilient and will allow you to grow as a company. So how can you trust attestation? Well, like we said before, it's based in cryptography as well. For attestation, a attestation certificate is included during registration. In a standard based attestation, you get your username, or I'm sorry, you get your make and model of the key. You can, as part of this, as a relying party, can access that key and provide the GUID to the device to the FIDO metadata service and verify the signature. You can do this at any time during any transaction. So that information that it's returning, though, is great because it's private and really does not have any unique information. Great for consumers, great for privacy, but not really ideal for enterprises where you want some level of management associated with it. Now, this brings out enterprise attestation. This, when you are buying your key, you can define at that point what you want in your enterprise attestation certificate, and then work with a partner like Intercede to make sure that that is being referenced during authentication and during registration, to make sure that you are continuing to keep that life cycle together, that this is the exact key that you are using and you are presenting from the time of registration all the way through. Two ways of doing that: vendor facilitated or platform managed. As you can see, vendor facilitated specifically writes to a limited number of relying party IDs to the authenticator during manufacturing, tying that key specifically to that RPID. Those, if it's vendor facilitated, it cannot change once it leaves to the factory. Platform managed then maintains a list of replying party IDs that are permitted to receive that enterprise attestation. That can be managed, but in some cases you have to change some browser settings to make this work. So let's get into some of the why. One big thing is limiting access. When you purchase something with enterprise attestation, you have to deal with really different or domains that will call for that registration, and you can prevent or allow that to take place. You can also do this through a managed browser. And that, sorry to fly through those parts, but I wanted to make sure we gave us enough time for Q&A. Alan, did you want to say a few words to?
Yeah, sure. So conscious we've really just scratched the surface of what is potentially a very, very deep topic here. So just wanted to refresh and talk about the key points from this. So what we're seeing is in regulated industries, the more recent the regulation, the more likely it is to call out specifics around authentication. So as opposed to some of the older legislation that states you need to understand your risks and protect against them, starting to get more and more specific, calling out two-factor authentication, looking at NIS2, calling out cryptography. But the pattern is they all tend to look outside of their own regulation to what is best practice, what does good look like? And a really good place to look at that is the NIS standards. They are the best funded security authority in the world, and they've done a really good job of creating those assurance levels and what do you need to do, not just from a what's the technology of the authenticator, but how do you manage it? How do you bind it to a person? How do you make sure you've got the right issuance policy in place? So that's a good place to start. You don't have to follow the guidelines exactly, but it's a really good place to start to come up with a what does good look like and what I should be doing. As part of that, we're also seeing more and more push for people to have phishing resistant authentication. So that's starting to be called out specifically. Passwords not phishing resistant, one-time passwords no longer seen as phishing resistant. Too many attacks out there and people spoofing websites, people calling up pretending to be somebody, getting them to release their one-time code, malware. We run a very large database of known compromised credentials. We're starting to see an increase in malware stealing those credentials. And that's great for the attacker because I'm not looking at a password that was years ago that I've since changed. I'm looking at very, very recent credentials. And if that's a one-time password, even if it's only valid for 10 or 15 minutes, that's all the attacker needs to log into your system and be you. So they can then get in, they can plant the ransomware, they can steal information. So more and more we're looking at cryptography is the only real way to become phishing resistant. And that boils down to PKI and FIDO. PKI has long been seen as the gold standard in very high assurance environments, government, military, aerospace, intelligence agencies, but it's potentially quite complex and costly to deploy for some people. So having another alternative there, FIDO passkeys, starts to become very interesting for organizations. But in the higher assurance world, they're starting to hit that challenge of passkeys have come from the consumer world and they've got those concepts such as privacy by design. So it's great to see the standards changing and being adopted. So they're becoming much more enterprise friendly. Things like change PIN on first use, things like enterprise attestation. So you do actually know which devices has which credentials on and allow those use cases and management around it. Is it one of mine? Inventory control, where physically is it, etc. And that capability, again, the final point is when we're starting to see customers wanting two types of phishing resistant PKI and passkeys on the same device, on a device that gives a good experience to the end user. So these are the real themes we're seeing. And finally, as a summary here, this technology is available. So the devices are available, the management software is available, the integration with your IDAM environments is available. Enterprise attestation is pretty new. So if you want to learn more about this, if you want to talk to us, if you want to talk about your specific use cases, want to see demonstrations of this, reach out to Yubico, reach out to Intercede. We'd be more than happy to follow up with further conversations. And on that, I'll hand over to Phil and see if we've had any questions in.
Yeah, we've had a few questions. So to begin, what is the difference between device attestation and enterprise attestation?
So it's the biggest thing is the data you get back. Standard device attestation, you're getting back a make and model of a key. Enterprise attestation, you can put more in that cert. So that way you can get back potentially a serial number.
And from a management perspective, it's what does that enable, I think is the important question. So it enables you to know these are my devices. I'm only issuing to the devices that I've bought from Yubico and I know they're mine and I know but nobody's just got one on Amazon or it's been swapped out in a particular strange country somebody's visited to be a pretend device or something like that. You know they're genuine, you know they're yours. And that then allows you to have high levels of management around things like inventory control, physically where are they, who's got what specific device. So the ability to bind credentials to a specific device, to a person, allows you to do things like automatic revocation, should that person leave the organization, revocation if they lose the device, that sort of control. So it gives you additional control.
Okay. Can you do self-service to collect the FIDO credentials when using Enterprise Attestation, or is it just for admin time issuance?
It's both. So you can do either. So you can have an operator-led issuance of this. The demonstration I actually showed was actually a self-service collection. So that was the environment where an operator or via APIs had requested somebody have a credential. That could be a passkey added onto an existing device. It could be a brand new device. That example, it's a brand new device. So that model is you've shipped the YubiKey device out to the individual and it's ready to have the credentials collected on it. The end user then via the self-service app has logged in. They can authenticate with a number of ways. So if they've got an existing MFA credential, they can use that. It could be Entra ID. It could be a one-time code sent out to the individual to allow them to authenticate and collect their credentials. And at that point, that will check that that device has Enterprise Attestation enabled. And if it doesn't, it won't let you issue it. And then it will work through and collect the passkeys, the PKI credentials, and pass those to whatever system it needs. So absolutely, it can be operator-led, centralized. It can be remote self-service. Yes, all available.
Next question. Who enables Enterprise Attestation? Do you need new hardware? Do you need new versions of MyID? And then when you have Enterprise Attestation enabled, what do you need to do then to see the serial numbers, etc., and take advantage?
So from a key perspective, you need to have it enabled from the factory. And then it will be available at that point on your key from then on out. On the back end side of it, I'll let Alan, because that's going to be a lot better of an answer.
So from the CMS credential management system perspective, we can mix and match devices that do and don't have enterprise attestation. So if you're already working with devices that don't have enterprise attestation, but you want to start introducing them into your environment, we can have a second credential profile, set of rules, issuance policy that says these particular devices now need to have enterprise attestation enabled. So you may want to roll those out to your admins. You might want to roll those out to new users, for example, so you can do that. And that will check that at that point. And it's a standard feature in the product. And I think from 12.14 onwards, so the last couple of versions at least in the product, we've had enterprise attestation supported. And if the device supports enterprise attestation, we support enterprise attestation. It's part of the FIDO standard, which is one of the advantages. So yeah, as Joe said, you just need to make sure that the devices you're getting from Yubico have this enabled, and then we can make use of it.
The next question, if we use Enterprise Attestation FIDO keys, will users be able to add credentials for applications outside of the Enterprise curated list, or will they need an additional non-EA FIDO key?
Now, they'll be able to add non-enterprise attestation referencing credentials to their key.
Yep. So it's the relying party that's specified, so you can lock down, in effect, what needs that. So at the point of issuance, we can check that for the credentials we're putting on and passing to Entra ID, for example, but you could put additional credentials on there that don't require that, yes.
Next one is, I thought FIDO doesn't allow you to get serial numbers for security reasons.
By definition, it does not. That's where enterprise attestation comes in. So if you want to be able to really have the ability to track that serial number from the factory, you can enable it and then you can reference it later. If you would prefer the privacy preserving approach, you don't have to. It's just harder to manage. So that way we can do both options. You just need to decide at the factory.
And this is one of the interesting points I think we've seen, where we've seen FIDO come from the consumer side, but we're starting to see a number of enterprises, government, for example, aerospace and defense, wanting to adopt it because it gives you that high level of assurance, that phishing resistance. But stumbling across, oh, I'm used to PKI backgrounds where I've got things like PIN policy and issue on behalf of, and I know a serial number. And it's great to see the FIDO Alliance react and bring these enterprise enabling features out as part of the standards, but just as it's an option. So if you want that, you can have that. But if you're in the consumer world, you wouldn't want that, so it's not available.
Okie doke. Next question. What are the benefits of rolling out enterprise attestation?
Comes down to manageability. If you want to assure that your users are using the YubiKeys that you purchased for them and only those keys, that's one of the ways to do it. If you also need a certain level of assurance to know that it's a specific key tied to a specific user, this is one of the ways to do it.
It's the use cases it enables, as Joe said. It's knowing it's one of my keys. That is a really simple security requirement that some of our larger customers have. I don't want anybody to rock up with their own key they've bought from some random country they've visited or something. So even if it's a YubiKey 55, I don't know the project of it. I don't know where it's come from. Is it one of mine? It is one of the key things. And then we start to get more inventory control. So how many of these have I got? Where are they? Which specific ones are where? We start to get management of it becomes really important if you've got multiple credentials on the same device as well, PKI and passkeys on the same device. So it enables some of that visibility. So you can have combined life cycle, that I know this person has lost that specific device because I know which PKI certificates and which passkeys were on that device. I can revoke those and make sure they're no longer usable. So it's that additional level of management and control it brings.
Next is, how does my ID know that the YubiKey that is being enrolled is the one I purchased for my enterprise? Does my ID implement an allow list?
Yes. So what you can do is you can import a range of serial numbers into the system, and it will check those serial numbers at the point of issuance, and it will get that serial number from that enterprise attestation certificate. So if it reads the enterprise attestation certificate, well, to start with, if you've set the policy up this way, if it doesn't have enterprise attestation, it doesn't know what the serial number is. It won't let you issue it. That's dependent on your policy settings. If it reads the serial number and it's not what it recognizes from that imported list, in effect the allow list, it will say, no, even though this device has enterprise attestation enabled, it's not one of mine, and it will block you issuing it.
Okay, next question. If we have a joint PKI passkey device, such as the YubiKey Bio series, can't you just use the PKI side of things for inventory management and person binding, or do you still need enterprise attestation on the passkey side?
No, you absolutely can use the PKI side to reference the serial number.
Without enterprise attestation, though, you won't know which device the passkeys are on. So absolutely, you can manage it with the serial number from the PKI side of the device. And the good news is that it's the same serial number. So that makes our job a lot easier. We know they're on the same physical device. So absolutely, on the PKI side, we can use that to manage the device, the inventory control, and know where it is. Without enterprise attestation, you don't know the passkeys are on the same device. So that's the only additional piece it brings you.
And we have definitely gotten calls about some use cases where it is very important that they know where that passkey originated from and how it ties back to basically PKI without being able to reference the PKI applet on the device.
Okay, there's just a couple more questions coming through. Can you provide insights into how the military can leverage enterprise attestation?
Sure, Tree. I think the best example is like we just talked about. Being able to utilize what you're used to with inventory control with PKI, but bring that to a FIDO environment. So you're not carrying around a CAT card to try to plug into a sled, which is plugged into a phone out in the field. This, you can use a token, touch and go, and still have that same level of strong authentication, but the same level of inventory control and management on the back end that you're used to.
The other piece I'd add to that is the ability to bind it back to an existing identity. So, for example, if you've got your PIV card, your CAT card, you're authenticating in, that's a very high assurance credential, probably the highest assurance credential out there. You've taken that person through background checks, you've verified their identity, you've done biometric checks, you've issued an extremely high assurance credential. If you want to issue them an additional credential, such as a passkey for particular applications, wouldn't it be great if you could use that initial credential to derive the second credential from, so you know it's bound back to that original identity? And that's exactly what a system like ours does. So that derived credential issuance allows self-service, so you get operational cost benefits of doing that, but it binds it back to that primary identity via that strong credential. All of that's tracked, all of that's traced, all of that's audited.
And I think to add to that derived credential model, with enterprise attestation, you can cryptographically prove that it was derived from
Yes.
the PKI credential during every transaction.
Yes.
You have that high level of assurance guaranteed throughout the whole chain.
Okay, that's all the questions that have come through. So
Okay.
Thank you, Phil.
So it just remains to say thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Joe, for joining us. Hopefully you got some insight from that. As we've said earlier, this is a huge topic. Both Joe and I could, over a couple of days, probably talk for days on this topic, which we'd be more than happy to do. So if you want any follow-up, any further information, please reach out to us via the information on screen, and we'd love to get on a call and talk further. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all very much.